So before we get moving into talking a bit about church, church hurt, some language around trauma, any thoughts or observations that people had after last evening? Are you gonna? Okay.
I'm just noticing how eclectic the room itself is in terms of folks who are in pain and others who are actually found a way through and are living a spiritually healthy journey. So to have that mix in the room is very interesting for this topic, and therefore not to assume anyone's arrived or that everyone's stuck. And so this will be a but I think the trauma conversation is something we all need to hear about, whether you need ministry or are a minister of some sort or a therapist, whatever.
And with that, the other therapist, if I'm not doing a good job, correct me, please. Any other comments or okay?
Yeah, I just kept thinking of that old adage that, we might be wounded in church community, but healing also comes through church community, and that we have a God who is acquainted with grief and sorrow. He bore our burdens, and we minister to each other through how Christ ministered to us.
Lovely, thank you.
I just want to build on what you just said based on what you and I talked about yesterday afterwards, and that can only come through trust, which is built over time. So that journey doesn't happen instantly, and at least maybe it does. God can do anything, but I feel like that's generally. I mean, I talked about being out of it for years, and I take responsibility for that as well. But I think that only comes through time and trust.
Lovely, yeah. Reconciliation is held within the space of promise for future relationship, which is a really beautiful thing to meditate and wonder on. Any other comments? All right.
As we were driving home last night, Joe and I talked a little bit about the concept of the wounded healer, and just how much more richness comes from that space. And most of the hurt that I've experienced has come from people who refuse to acknowledge their vulnerability or their own hurt.
Beautiful, beautiful. All right, Brian.
For me, there was a number of things said last night that were profound, but when David said fraternity versus community, that really struck a chord, because I've been in the church, I've been in the trenches for over 4 decades trying to help come alongside people in churches, and when you're a fraternity, you can make statements like, if you don't fill in the blanks, if you don't do what I want, I'm taking my money out of here. That's a fraternity saying, right? So it was really helpful to hear that last night. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think that's some of the tone that we're going to take into our conversation this morning. And thinking about fraternity and community and this idea, the systemic view that we're all people and we all have families. And then noticing our experience of the church and the family experience. So it's really natural. What's hidden in plain sight is the parallel between our family experience, our biological family experience, and our spiritual family experience. And the energy between people is mysterious, just like the energy that we belong to, which is God, is deeply mysterious. So of course it's something that we can be confused by. And what I've been thinking about, and I talked about the cosmos last night, which I have no right to talk about, so now I'm going to talk about trees, which I shouldn't talk about either. But thinking about root systems, and I didn't really, I can't remember where I heard this, about a taproot. But I always just thought of trees having these big, expansive root systems that gain nutrients, the minerals, anchor a plant well. But there's also this deeper root, a taproot. And the taproot is the anchor of the plant. It is the core of absorbing nutrients. There's more of a vitalness to this root and the life of the plant. Now, both are essential. Both are created to, bring life. But the danger in some of our current wondering about evangelical or our North American church experience is we can forget the taproot. And one of the things that I love when I talk with David about is how he reminisces his experience of his own taproot and his family. And even though I think your faith pattern is very different than your parents, or your, I guess, being more of an Orthodox mindset and your parents being more traditional North American Christian mindset. I don't even know what denomination they were.
Did you know my parents?
Well, it's
I'm
been
shocked.
a while, but only through your eyes and your voice.
Well, we all migrate. I mean, that's in the nature of life. So I would say that my faith is no different than my parents. We add layers to the onion unless you decide to strip the onion. But in my view, it was more I treasure what I was given and seek to have it continue to grow.
And that connects with the comment about the wounded healer that we heard earlier, where there's this, what are we going to do with our pain? And what are we going to do with peeling the layers to get to, the center of the onion, I think, is just much more delicious than the exterior, personally. But it's also the pain and the tears that come with peeling the onion. So keeping in mind this image up here, I'm going to make a plug for, we do have our Conversations for Restoration Facebook group. And this image will be in there later today. Or if you want, you can find me on Instagram or Facebook, and let's be friends, because I'm friends with a lot of other people in this room. So if you find me, you can find some of these lovely people to connect with. But thinking about fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, and sensing into words up there that you might identify with, or maybe you already have wondered about an area that you are more drawn to. Lots of us are in more than one of these quadrants. We can say, oh, I see this in myself, and I see that. But it's really important to know. I had a conversation with one of my church friends who's a firefighter, and he's afraid he hurt my feelings because we were talking about social justice. And so he privately got a hold of me to make sure that he hadn't hurt me. And as people helpers, we leaned into this conversation about our flavor of PTSD. Now, I don't necessarily think that I would have that diagnosis. I would have some markers. But a frontline worker, there's more potential. And we were having this conversation about how we might have a natural tendency. Lots of frontline workers are more emotional withdrawers, either a freezer or a fleer, something like that. And then they're put into this job where they're constantly fighting. I see fire and I run towards it. So even that idea of how my natural tendency, now I have to have a different adrenaline reaction. My lid flips and I run where my instinct is to go the other way. So even that, holding that in our own space. If I have more than one of these responses, that's really hard inside. And then thinking about, as well, in our spiritual experiences. So there's Michael's story is an amazing story of what we would definitely define as a traumatic experience. And then Michael is able to tie it forward to also notice some of the spiritual dilemma. And what do I do in a time of spiritual dilemma when I have this natural biological tendency wired into my brain? So it's an interesting dilemma that not everybody's going to consider, but for us, as we're trying to recover from church hurt, institutional trauma, spiritual abuse, whatever language you want to use, and we're trying to philosophize, which isn't a word, but it should be, into what is deconstructing, is we're bringing the mindsets, the different ologies together. So we're trying to think psychologically about our theology and having this wondering of how does my being, how does my biology, how does my nervous system, how does my neurology interact with what is so important. I mean, I think theology is my favorite ology. I don't know. So thinking about this, and then in the space of conversation about some of the history, the distorted story of evangelical, the danger of us getting lost and viewing it as a ism, and then also your story too, David, of holding on to your taproot, which is some of your family, your biological family, within the greater root system of your spiritual journey. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking at you. I don't know if you have anything to say at this moment.
Well, I'm just listening to you and seeing where you're going. A couple responses. I'm interested in the fact that the ancient church had disciplines. They had a variety of disciplines. These disciplines were there because they had thought over time that these disciplines would be helpful for human beings to deal with exactly what you are diagnosing. That is, with trauma. Why? Because the view was that all human beings have been traumatized. You can call it by various names. Some people call it original sin. My tradition doesn't. My tradition calls it the ancestral sin. That is, we are born into the world and we're bequeathed many things. We're bequeathed the moment in time. We're bequeathed what our mother, our father, what they all brought to the table. We have a particular language, a particular culture. So in a sense, I've always thought that sin, to miss the mark, in both Hebrew and Greek, to miss the mark. And of course for the Jews, and we must remember Jesus Christ was Jewish, the mark was not heaven. The question wasn't, is there life after death? The question was, is there life before death? The question was, can you live now? Is it possible to be present? Or are you just going to live your life projecting onto the world, changing the world, making the world in your own image, instead of realizing that God created the world and you are the image of God? So, with that notion of that deep sense that there is, and the Apostle Paul is brilliant on this, that death, because alienation, all forms of alienation are death. I've thought recently, for the first time in my life, my Lord, It takes a long time. That the commandment, thou shalt not kill, that I have sinned against that commandment. Not once, not twice, many times. Because I have viewed another human being as not the image of God. That's murder. That's murder. So if you have an enemy, you're a murderer. It's astonishing. So this notion that it's not what human beings are, but it's what we make of ourselves, and it happens so early in life. But there are disciplines. So it's interesting to think of your profession, because I view you and all of the professions involved in psychological healing. That is a ministry. That is a form of discipline. But there is an ancient discipline, and that discipline is called confession. And we all practice it. At least, I think we all practice it. You may practice it with a loved one. I know that people like my friend Ted and Irene, Brad and Michael, you may not know this, but for many years, all three of these people used to go to the bar every Thursday night. And there they would confess to the bartender. They would speak of their intimacies, and the bartender would give them a little bit of the Spirit to help them arise again. But let me just give you one illustration of this, if I can. In my church, my little ship of fools, which I treasure, there was a woman who I did not know, Eastern European, elderly, but she looked like she was a walking isometric and angry. I said hello to her a few times, but I never got to know her. There's a discipline, and it's a discipline that occurs a little later this year in the Eastern Christian tradition. It's an ancient discipline. Between resurrection, Pascha as we call it, we use the Hebrew word, the Passover. Between resurrection and ascension, in a number of Eastern Christian churches, they go to the cemetery and they bless the graves. They name the person. They name them with holy water, incense, put a linen cloth on, have a basket, bread and wine, the body and blood of our Lord, and usually some sweet treat, like Lifesavers. And it's always nice on a grave. Or a Sweet Marie chocolate bar. In any case, there's this tradition of going and blessing the graves, and it's usually done by communities. And out in eastern part of Alberta, this is the biggest feast in the neighborhood, bigger than Christmas. Go out to a place like Andrew at the right time of year, and it's extraordinary. But it occurs in these churches. Now, I knew one of the priests who called me after this event and talked to me because he wanted to share it with somebody. This woman, her husband was brutal, abusive, terribly abusive. But this woman was pious. She knew that she had to do these things the church disciplined her to do. So she went to confession. She would go to confession at least twice a month. And her confession would always be the same. Many people go to confession and confess somebody else's sins towards them. Her confession always included the fact that she hated her husband. She hated him. He was a bastard. The priest in confession would listen to this. And then he would say, rise up. He would say, I have no power to forgive you, but you know Olga, God forgave you before you sinned. Turn away from it. Turn your back on it. Let it go. Resurrect. But she could not. 2 weeks would go by, and it was the same, because it's deep, and it's got a hold of her. 13 years later. And during that 13 years, she would always go to the cemetery. And this is what would happen. She wouldn't go with the community. She'd say to the priest, I can't go with the community. They all know he was a bastard. I just want to go by myself with you. So the priest would go with her. He would begin. You all use incense and holy water here, don't you? You know about these things. He would begin to shake his censer. And it begins like, Heavenly King, Comforter. Listen to these words. It's an ancient prayer. Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of truth, who is everywhere present, even in my sin, even in my sorrow, even in my tragedy, even in my drama, and fillest all things, treasury of every good and giver of life, come and abide with us and save our soul, O good one. That's how it begins. And then the person is named. May Igor come to a verdant field. May Igor come to a place of peace. What is that about? It's not about Igor. Anytime you are praying some request to God, it's bouncing back. That's the point. You need to hear that. That's the point. So, may you come to a place of peace, a verdant field, in the memory of the one who is in the eternal. May you come to a fruitful place and be free from the trauma defining your life. So, 13 years. She did it for 13 years. Confession over and over again. And on that day, the priest called me and said, we were just there. I began, Heavenly King Comforter. She collapsed, sobbing on the grave, sobbing. When he finished, he went down and laid with her on the grave. Took a half an hour before she got control of herself and stood up. Because every previous time when he had finished his prayer, she had said thank you and turned around and spit on his grave. 13 years. 13 years. And on this day, she sobs her heart out and gets up and says, now I know where I am in it. I forgive him. And she walked upright from then on in to her own departure of this life. So the disciplines and the time. But there's one other thing I wonder about here in terms of the way you see this. In the ancient church and in this discipline, the trauma, the pain, the sorrow, the sin is never at the center. It's never denied. It's always there, but it's not the point. That is normal. I think sin, in my understanding of the Christian tradition, many of you know it deeply, perhaps more deeply than I. Sin seems to me, at its most elemental level, to be a code word for experience. And the great comment of Jesus Christ, the Christian Magna Carta, is we all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. That's the Magna Carta. That's our freedom. Sin is not the point. It's lessening the time of missing the mark to awakening to the time that you are in God's grace and are invited back into communion. So I wonder, is one of the challenges that if we have experienced wounds and isolation or even being turfed out of church, we can become fixated on that. I've described one ancient discipline about how to deal with that, but it's held within the larger liturgical world, which always has at its very center the God-man and an invitation to become the man God. The invitation to become who you really are, to recover who you are, because we're made in the image of God, and that gets clouded over. How do we restore that? So there's this, the whole liturgical life is holding up before us a kind of meta-narrative about who we are, what the journey is. And part of that is suffering and healing. But we're constantly reminded, we remember. That doesn't mean memory. That means to become a part again. We become a part again of, well, technically we call it the body of Christ, which really is a way, we become that simply through being restored in our own mind, coming to realize who we are. We are not our PTSD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do you deal with this?
Oh my word, David, I have a billion thoughts from what I love drinking from the fire hose. I'm thinking of Olga and, her piety of trying to peel back the layers of the onion and trying, and the pain and the beauty of her diligence all those years until the prayer had bounced back enough that she could hear herself and her pain, and she broke through to not hate her husband. I think of my friend the firefighter and him coming to me and worrying that he hurt my feelings because he thought he was being big and scary, and the same tone of a big and scary guy doesn't come and say, "Are you okay, friend?" And both of those stories are such beautiful examples for living in our touch point with Jesus. One of my other wise good friends, Ron Dart, this past week we were talking about action and contemplation, and he said it's about finding our stillness in the movement. And I want to talk a little bit about Paul, and I also want to talk about our window of tolerance. So our window of tolerance is really like our happy and healthy place. It's where our wellness exists. So our wellness is our identity, our social, emotional, intellectual, physical, occupational, spiritual self. This is our ingredients for life. Mine is going to look different than yours. And we want to have this sort of natural emotional balance in there. But if we go too low or we go too high, that's when we become dysregulated. Our lid flips. That's a term that a lot of people know, that language. And when my lid flips and I'm in adrenaline, these things show up. the spiritual wisdom of psychology is how do we stay in our window of tolerance, because that is the place where we can peel back our behavioral, our cognitive, our emotional layers of our onion, but then also our spiritual, our existential epiphany. And this is a lot of what Paul is talking about in his letters, and I don't know, letters? Is there another term, or did he just wrote letters, right? But he's answering questions. People are saying, what about this? And Paul's saying, this is an answer for your specific question, whatever it might be. This isn't generalized. But a lot of what Paul is saying is, here's some ideas within the presence of God. If we really look at what Paul is teaching, this is my experience, current experience with Paul, is he's always benchmarking his kind strategies for moral living within the presence of God, specific to the person he's addressing. And what I believe about Pauline theology right now that feels like just great psychology is moral reasonability helps us maintain our window of tolerance better. The better decisions I make, whatever they might be, then when I flip my lid, I have a little scuffle with my firefighter friend. We could have just, just had a good fight or something. But here's two people who are trying to figure out ways to live within their window of tolerance as much as possible. And when our trauma got stirred up, we were able to find our way back in. And in that gracious space, my friend comes to me and checks on me, and I can be available. And in that vulnerable space, there's a micro repair that happened. Didn't have to happen. We were both okay. But there's some of these things with mental diagnoses, with our trauma that we all have, like David said, accumulating good decisions, living well, being a decent human being is good for our mental health, because there's going to be times when we're not. So I believe in nonviolence, but I have children. and nothing has proved to me more that I don't think people are capable of perfect nonviolence, because I love those guys, but man, there's a lot of rage that happens inside, and figuring out how to manage that as often as possible, as well as possible. And then when my lid flips, and it's not just the mom voice that shows up, it's the mean mom, how I find my footing to go back in and repair. And so there's the individual, the view of self, our growing towards a positive view of self, but also our growing towards a positive view of others and a positive view of God. I'm listening to David, and I'm thinking of Thomas Merton, one of my closest friends. And today I posted something that Merton says, I'm going to paraphrase it terribly, but it still works, is how we speak and live and show God says more about who we are than it does about God. And another thing that I wrote down that Merton says, I think both of these are from New Seeds of Contemplation. I know this one is for sure. But this is some of the risk, and this is something that I lived when my church hurt, flipped my lid, is the confusion between isolation and solitude. And Merton says, true solitude is the home of the person. False solitude, the refuge of the individualist. And individualist is just a really important term for our North American culture, whether we're tying it to the church or not. We're in an individualistic culture. The collective culture is broken. That's part of our pain too. That's our family, our church family experience. the ways that we're hurting people in the community, bullying, abusing. The Merton quote, "True solitude is the home of the person. False solitude, the refuge of the individualist. True solitude is reflected in that touch point with Jesus, that stillness in the movement, the dance between contemplation and action. Why there's Mary and Martha in the story, Leah and Rachel, Cain and Abel, like these pieces of maintaining balance, and when it's distorted, Cain and Abel, the distortion of trying to polarize."
Can I ask you something about the way you framed this, because you've said several things here. But I'm interested in this notion of what you called a window of tolerance. And you said that that was one of the things that the discipline of psychology helps regulate. And I think you're right. You know, I read all the great psychological masters and enjoyed them a lot. I speak about Uncle Sigmund on occasion. And the Neo-Freudians, not my cup of tea. But I wonder, Tara. And you also mentioned moral goodness. Paul does speak about all those things, but he also says something more. And in my little part of the Christian ocean, we also try to pull up that something more, not to say, not as if it's free of what you've said. Indeed, these things are part of the human journey. But Paul speaks about the renewal of your mind. And the renewal of your mind, at least in my understanding, is not moral. In fact, I think Christianity is not a moral religion. It's about transfiguration. It's about a fundamental shift in the whole way in which you are present to the world. So, these disciplines, certainly psychology gives us many good tools. But I would also suggest, and I'm happy to hear you counter this, that within the ancient church, virtues were important. You know, we've made a big shift here, which I think has confused many religious people. We kicked out virtues in the 18th century and following that with the advent of capitalism and ushered in values. And values are very confusing because values are always part of a particular social and cultural place and advantage. Virtues are of a different order. Virtues are all about excellence, arete. Everybody has virtue. That's the Christian teaching. That's the radicalness of the gospel. Every human being is the image of God. It's not about what they believe. It's not about how they behave. It's that they are. That's the wonder. They are. So we need these disciplines like psychology and this notion of a window of tolerance. But we have to remember tolerance is a political word. It's a political word about trying to help us restrain ourselves so that we don't do what we really want to do.
I think this is important to totally interrupt you. Because this is, too, the risk of the individualistic experience, the individualistic culture. You know, part of, transfigured way of being is way better language. the corrective epiphany inside. Even thinking about what the word tolerance means. All of these things are so important. And this is deconstructing.
Yeah, tolerance isn't accepting. Tolerance is putting up with.
Yeah.
That's why we have doctrines of tolerance in the civil life.
So
and they're good. They're important.
Sure, window of epiphany. Let's coin that phrase. But even, this is too one of some of our friends here. David Tenson wrote a book called Decentering Everything, and it's really about the tragedy of how the loss of the collective culture. I think that's some of what we're all grieving when we're thinking about those church spaces, the nostalgia, the childhood mystery that we experienced until we didn't. And now we're all trying to find our way back to that mystery, which is God. But there's this eldering, eldering, sometimes we just think, okay, because David's older, he's an elder. But the wisdom of sitting with a friend who thinks differently and does know more. And to be able to do the glass bead game properly. Now, when we get stuck in these isms, people say ism, schism, and then I can't remember who I was talking about. What do ologies do when they're not in relationship to others? I don't know. I was trying to make a funny dad joke, but it's like I don't have the genes for it, I guess. Or maybe I do. That was pretty good. That was all right. All right. You got that on recording, right? Thank you. But when this is too some of the church herd experience, how I was raised is that you stick in the theology. You don't go into psychology. You don't go into science. You don't think about evolution. You don't think about these other things. Cosmos even was not something that I was raised to honor because it was risky business. And yet when we bring these things together, because when I was outside of the church and I found attachment theory, I found Father again, and then I found Jesus again. Because that was the corrective epiphany, that was the transfiguration. And I can call it the window of tolerance was starting to find its way. My lid was finding a way to not be so flipped. But transfiguration and epiphany are just way more beautiful traditional words.
Well, they're gesturing to a metanoia, to a profound transformation that is not guaranteed, that we see in the lives of saints in certain moments. But we have to remember that the lives of saints in my tradition are just the ancient church's diagnostic manual for mental disease. So when you look at the lives of saints, you see all the neurosis that is in the whole of the human family. And in many ways, the scripture is that too. I mean, the whole of the scripture is, there are two revelations, two golden strands that run through the scripture, it seems to me. One of them is that God is constantly wooing the human family. That's why in the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, we always speak about God as the lover. And the Greek word that's used is not agape, it's eros. God pursues us, which is simply another way of saying meaning pursues us. Well, maybe or maybe not. In any case, in the lives of saints as well, you see that dis-eases. These are dis-eases. And what's the other side of that? The other side of that is peace. The peace which passes understanding. So that one is all of the things that you've put up here, yes, they're there. But we are invited. We are invited we are called to come to a place where we don't respond that way.
The stillness in the
that's there.
action. Yeah, or in the movement.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's the right time to ask, but I'll just ask. Yeah, so, but I mean, you don't have to answer. You could say, oh, that'll be later. But just our dis-ease with a certain type of temperament that is at dis-ease with being at ease. In other words, addiction to drama, like the window of tolerance or whatever is like you start crawling in your own skin. So I've got to go create drama, and it seems to me that that's common enough that it might come into the conversation of how to address that.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a great question, Bradley. It's okay that you asked it. I'll just answer and then I'll grab you, okay, Janet? You want to answer it?
I think it's actually very similar to what you said, because one of the things that I was just wondering is, you know, how can I, what was the question? I can only go so far with an overactive nervous system, right? So if I'm able to, in my mind or in my heart, but then if my body is still reacting, and I think that's similar to what you were saying about being dis-ease with ease, like having very unsettled at peace, in peace.
And how that affects the community too. I mean, it's not just me. It's like, oh, I'm. How that would affect a church community or any kind of community? Because like, okay, it's time to throw a grenade now because I can't stand the stillness anymore.
Yeah, I'm not answering that. No, just kidding. I'll say something, but those are big and important questions. I mean, in my book, what I notice is our autopilot way of being, our defaults, and these are just the sort of facades. Or, you know, we talked about David Hayward. If you don't follow the naked pastor, follow the naked pastor. Just saying. But his image, his cartoon of just the false smiley face. And our ways that we can really function behaviorally, that's some of what David is talking about, the risk of, it's fine to talk about window of tolerance and moral reasonability and all these things, but the corrective epiphany, like how do these things saturate our hearts, our way of being, like Olga. You know, it took as long as it took. But the disease of dis-ease, and being mindful to see what are my vices, my behavioral vices. So, believe it or not, I overachieve. I like workaholism. Those things are really fun ways to cope and to avoid my body. But finding those things, you know, people please? Am I overly sweet? A lot of Christians are caregivaholics. You know, do I have a God complex? Was I raised by somebody with a God complex that was trying to save me? Mm-hmm.
Since we're all kind of sharing here, I just was thinking within the evangelical tradition, how we have opted for that moral normalcy to try to control the chaoticness, and to say if you want to be a part of this group, you need to fit within this parameter and stuff like that. And how the evangelical church has, we've sold ourselves short from transfiguration to compliance or to fraternity. And if you want to maintain within this group, please stay within this allowed area.
That's helpful. And
It's one of the temptations of Antichrist.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 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 And well, and just thinking, I've been thinking about this, and it's half baked, but I don't know if it needs to be baked anymore. Maybe it's like a brownie. So, is that a dad joke? Yes, I'm doing it. Where are my children? My kids are 8 and 9, and Mom, you're so cringe, is what I hear a lot. That's a great word, but I am. So, thinking about worm theology is something we talk about, and this we're rotten to the core, and these lies that we've been told about our identity, that's bad psychology. And when we start to discover our pure of heartness, or what we're being restored to, which is our identity in Eden, and those things, which are better, they're just good psychology. They argue for a God that has created pure of heart little beings. How we describe God says more about us. And one of the real consequences of worm theology is worm psychology. And so it's kind of like a sad thing, and I'm going to bear with me when I bring up this example. But I remember when Dobson brought psychology more into the church, and I was raised psychology was evil. So Dobson brought it in, and it was refreshing because there's people who struggle. We're all chemical equations, and our chemical equations go off, and then what do I do? And so bringing in psychology, starting to have these interfaces of the ologies. But then what broke was we took psychology and we worm theologied it. And then the church lives in this worm psychology where we can hate people and we can other them. And that is not psychology. That is not good science. And then it's like, well, what if there's good science? Where does good science come from? If attachment theory is true, that we are loved, lovable, and loving before anything, where does that come from? I was in a Bible study. Father Daniel is also going to be at our events in May. He's a priest. He's an iconographer. I don't know if he's certified. I don't know about how that happens. And a musician. But I was in his Bible study this past week, and we were talking about the baptism of Jesus. And one of the women said, Father God put it in John's heart to baptize Jesus before Jesus started his ministry. And there was things, Jesus in the temple as a child, but before the real big movement. And the comment she said is Jesus was already beloved. Even Jesus, that action, that beloved action, the radical action of baptism. And so, the love within the Trinity. Father loves Jesus, Jesus loves Spirit, Spirit loves Father. They all love each other. And that's the template that we belong to. So dis-ease, disease. Part of it is awareness. Part of it is self-love. Were you raised to love yourself? Because that's not included in worm psychology or worm theology. And so there is this place that is not dangerous, New Age, Eastern craziness that's going to ruin or damage your soul to just like yourself. Because if I like myself, maybe I can like other people, or I can care. My friend who checked in on me, my firefighter friend, that's not a big scary guy. That's a man who has some self-liking so that he could wonder if I was seeing the true reflection of who he was. Olga, when her husband passes, what was she experiencing or seeing? I believe that death is our final birth. Stephen Mitchinson has a great book, Dying for Life. He's a palliative care doctor in Abbotsford. That was his thesis at SSU, just saying. I love SSU. But when we die into our final birth, we're in the fullness of our identity. And Olga's husband was in the fullness of his identity.
I see this a little differently.
You can.
Good. I'm glad. But just a couple things in response to what you laid out. I think Freud is worm psychology, because Freud and the foundations of psychology really, and I mean, I really appreciate Freud, probably much more than many of you here. I just think it's sad that we fractured our intellectual tradition in such a profound way that we'd completely forgotten about the brilliant understanding of the human soul and of the human mind and the human heart. The brilliant understanding of what is the human nature and what is the journey to personhood, which, by the way, is not the same as identity. Freud, the best he could do was to say the human person is a battle between id, superego, and ego. And the best we can do is that window of tolerance, is coming to a place of kind of stabilizing it. He may be right. He may, in fact, descriptively, scientifically be right. But my part of the Christian tradition says, well, who knows, but we're going to say it differently. We're going to say you are capable. God is calling you to be whole, and to not react, to not fight, to not flight, to not do these things at all. You can come to a different place. You can come to the place of the presence of the kingdom. And that requires death. If that's the death you're talking about, I agree. If it's mortality, I don't. We are meant for life, not for death. And we're not meant for life after death. We're meant for the eternal life. That is a life which, I mean, the word mortality carries this. We forget what the word mortality means. Morte, morte, morte. Death, death, death. Immortality doesn't mean no death. It means not living through the prism of death. Not living through the prism of death. Because that's the problem with us. That's what Paul was pointing to. Have the renewal of your mind. See the world as God sees it.
I think it's really important how you're saying that.
Which was Steve's exact.
Yeah. So the book is still good. Dying for Life, Steve Mitchinson. But it is because there's the risk, and what you're catching, you're holding me accountable to, is it could be misunderstood, like some of our old bad theology. You do these things to earn your ticket because all you're trying to do is die to get to heaven. But it's this daily dying. I want to have as much of the pain here. I have a friend who's like, don't you want to have as much hell here because on the other side all your senses are awakened? And I've said this to you before, David, but like I love Dante's Divine Commedia, and I'll tell the joke. It's not really a joke. The truth is, the first time I read it was at a conservative Christian school, and we only read Inferno because we couldn't read Purgatorio. So we never got to Paradiso. It's just like, you can't get to Paradiso without Purgatorio if you're reading Dante. But one of the commentaries I've read on Dante likens Purgatorio to psychoanalysis. I think that's really true. There's this processing through the image to icon, the image and icon dance, and how that is being beautifully questioned and knit together by Dante. And also Dante sort of saying, do we other? Who do we put where? See, he put his mentor in hell. He put his dad there. I don't think he's doing that because he hated his mentor. Virgil takes him all the way, and then Virgil goes back. And it's this thing of, to me, I read that and I'm like, and he put people who committed suicide in Purgatorio. And Constantine's in heaven. It's like, really, this is just why, because it's this interplay of like what we think Why? If I have choice, my God complex, what do I do with it? But we talked, David and I and some friends were meeting in his backyard, and there's a spiritual director there with us. And I said, I think psychology only gets us through purgatorio. The paradiso stuff is not the window of tolerance. It's the corrective epiphany. I'm more in the attachment realm of work, and I think a lot of people here are emotion workers that I know. So we like to come bottom up, but we still need some behavioral top-down things. Those like the good advice or like thought stopping, all those strategies that work. And yet, the pure of heart identity, the restoration, the remember stuff, that can't necessarily happen in my office. Or today. And then the other risk is when we talk about confession, and confession happens in community, not necessarily fraternity. So we just sort of all live in the moment together, so we don't have to tell each other.
Olga spent 13 years
Yep.
and more in purgatory.
Yes.
But that did not cast her out.
No.
She could do it there. There was disciplines for it there. There was no expectation there.
Yep.
There was holding it there. So disciplines of holding.
And one of my colleagues who's of the Orthodox tradition, as a psychologist, will refer to psychologists, people helpers, therapists as the secular priest. And it's beautiful and it's honoring of us, but it's also really such a sad grief that the pastoral care is happening in purgatorio so much more and more. And the pain of the collective culture and the pain of figuring out how I remember the taproot of the family that I belong to. And don't throw the baby out with the bathwater with our theology. I think that's really dangerous. Don't throw that baby out. Because I think that baby's Jesus. But
Can I just give you a touch on taproot?
yes.
Because I'd never thought about this before. In Romania, in Transylvania, and you know what Transylvania is famous for? Yeah, some of you actually have mimicked that person, I'm sure. In Transylvania, you have these magnificent Romanian churches. They go back to the Middle Ages. They're of the most beautiful architecture in the world. And they're all completely painted from top to bottom in the classical manner on the inside of Byzantine iconography. But the unique part of the Transylvania churches is that they're also painted on the outside. The whole of the outside is iconography. On the north wall of these churches, you have 3 registers. The lowest register on the north wall, I'm getting to taproot, under rhizome. On the lowest register of the north wall, you have Jesse lying on his back with the roots coming out of him. And there you have little mandalas in these roots as they spread out all across that low register. And the mandalas are all of the ancestors of our Lord. The prostitute, the non-Jew, all of them are there. All of them. Those ancestral accounts, the genealogy accounts, we have 2 of them, of course, in the Gospels. One of them doesn't go back all that far. And the other one goes all the way back to Adam, who was the Son of God. Isn't it interesting? Adam had no mother. And Jesus Christ had no earthly father. It's telling us something. It's telling us something. In any case, you have the ancestors of Jesus. And then who do we have? We have a rondel with the image of Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Petrarch. Why? Well, because they had a profound effect on the early church fathers. It was the language of the culture. It was the Greek language, trying to figure out, trying to respond to the question, who do you say that I am? In the language that was given. So I love the word taproot, and of course,
Yes.
my taproot goes back to Adam and Eve, as does yours. But I also love the fact that there's also rhizome. You know, it spreads out whimsically, surprisingly, and pops up. There is light that comes from these various and sundry places. And that's why, despite what I've said about Uncle Sigmund, he's a gift. He's a gift to us and to our culture. Yep. But he's a gift when we remember that we stand on the shoulders and in the presence of the great cloud of witnesses. Evagrius Ponticus, 5th century Syrian monk, in his little book, 2 little books, Chapters on Prayer and the Practicos, I've often said, tells us far more, makes Freud, Jung, and Adler look like Presbyterian Sunday school teachers, who are, by the way, the best Sunday school teachers. But Sunday school teachers nevertheless. Rhizome and taproot.
Yeah. And it's interesting, like even with Freud, and he's kind of an easy target, let's be honest. Although he is a father, and he's where would we be without Freud in this field as well? You know, I think of like the roots that Dobson laid in my life, you know, and like the broken view that I have of that school of thought now, but still that window that was open for so many of us because of people like Dr. James Dobson. Even though the worm psychology has corrupted and skewed and done so much damage, there's still these things, and that's confusing as well, but that's some of the dis-ease. What are we going to be dis-eased with? Are we going to be dis-eased with not being a part of the fraternity? And then in the community where all the misfits are. Because we're all just people like everybody else, and sometimes we're good and sometimes we're bad. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, we didn't hear the name of the saint or the father that you were comparing to Jung, Freud, and Adler. I'm just wondering if you could repeat it or even spell it.
His name is Evagrius, Evagrius, Ponticus, Pontcus. It's a book, coming back to some of what Tara said, it's a book that Thomas Merton really encouraged the publication of. And by the time it was published in 1970, that's when I first read it, published by the Cistercian Fathers. The introduction is written by a marvelous scholar who's a Dominican monk named Jean Leclerc, one of the real masters of medieval church history and thought. He says in the introduction that he says in the preface that this preface should have been written by Thomas Merton because he was the one that had recognized the significance of this work. And but alas, as you may know, Thomas Merton took a trip to Bangkok, Thailand, to speak at one of the first conference since the ancient world where monks gather from the Christian and Buddhist and Hindu traditions and speak to each other. This happened in the ancient world, but not in the modern world until then. I think it was 68, and Merton gave his talk and went back to his apartment and took a shower and was accidentally electrocuted, entered the eternal. So in any case, Ponticus, you have to get through the medieval language, Because you see, we forget what psychology means. Psyche, the Greek word for soul. It's all about soul work. And what's the nature of the soul? What are the various elements of the soul? Well, the church spent an enormous amount of time thinking about this and sorting through it. So, Bamberger, who is also a Cistercian abbot, he did his doctorate in medieval philosophy, and then he also did a doctorate at Freud's school in Vienna. So he writes the introduction to this, and he helps us deal with the code, because we all have codes. Medieval language of demonology and modern psychological language of neurosis and psychosis. He builds the bridges. And then you understand the gifts and the limitations. But for me, the big difference is the anthropology. The Christian anthropology is grounded in Genesis 3. And God made man. Male and female created he them in his image and likeness. And God said, it is a delight. Whereas Freud and modern thought begins, it's as if they bought Calvin's critique and not his understanding of the glory of God. As if they just bought the diagnosis of the disease and end up saying that the human being is a package of diseases or just a chemical phenomena or a material phenomena. I reject that. I reject it not because I don't think it's true or I don't think it's a fact. I just don't think it's true. You know, you can have lots of facts that don't participate in the truth. We're a wonder. Human beings are a wonder. And I like that wonder to be there. I'm with God on that, even though I don't know God. I'm with God on that. Every human being is the image of God. And we're invited to the likeness.
Yeah, wonderful. And we're gonna, so do we have time for a, like experiential before the break, right? We have 15 minutes, is that right, or no? Yes. Okay. So, yes. Food for thought in what we've talked about. Knowing that, you know, we can't hit it completely out of the park, right? So the grace that we're, you know, this is, I'm not teaching doctrine, and neither is David. We're thinking together about some really important things and seeking some restoration in our own hearts and truth.